She gave me a photograph on my way out, pressed it into my hands at the door, both of her hands wrapped around mine, the way very old women do when they want to make sure something reaches you properly. It was him at maybe 17, before the army, before any of it, standing in front of a lake somewhere, squinting into the sun, grinning like the world hadn't shown him its real face yet. She'd had it in a frame by the door. She took it off the wall and gave it to me like it was a relic, like I was worthy of it. I stood on her porch for a long time after the door closed. The photograph, the afternoon light, the smell of the casserole she'd insisted on feeding me before I could leave. Because that's what women like her do. They feed you. It's the only leverage they have against the size of their grief. I stood there and I looked at that 17-year-old face, and I thought about the 2 hours I had just spent inside that house. 2 hours. I had lied for 2 hours, straight, without flinching, without losing the thread, without letting my eyes do anything my voice wasn't doing. I had looked a 78-year-old woman in the face, and I had told her that her son was everything she needed him to be. I am the last man alive who knows what he actually was, and I am going to take that to my grave, willingly, without hesitation, without a single moment of moral doubt. There is a particular kind of man that appears in every war, in every unit, in every situation where groups of men are under sustained pressure for extended periods of time. The military doesn't create this man. The military simply reveals him, strips back the surface behavior that civilian life allows people to maintain, and shows you who's actually underneath. Private Dale Miller was the kind of man who revealed himself quickly. He was from somewhere in rural Georgia, 22 years old, average height, soft in a way that 12 weeks of basic training hadn't quite resolved. He had a quality about him that I noticed on day one, and that I spent the next 8 months trying to determine the precise name for. It wasn't laziness exactly. It wasn't cowardice at first, though it became that. It was something more like a fundamental orientation toward his own comfort above all other considerations. Like his survival instinct had been miscalibrated somehow, tuned to the wrong frequency, so that it protected him from inconvenience rather than from actual danger. Small things first. That's always how it starts with these men. Small things that you could explain away individually, but that accumulate into a pattern that every man in the unit reads clearly, even if nobody names it directly. He was consistently 15 minutes late to anything that required him to be cold or wet. His equipment was always the last to be checked, always the least maintained. He had a talent for being elsewhere when work details were assigned and reappearing when they were completed. These things, in a peacetime unit, produce a particular kind of soldier. A marginal one, a drag, but manageable. In a combat environment, they produce something more dangerous. I remember the incident with Kowalski's rations clearly because Kowalski told me about it at about 2 in the morning while we were on watch, in that flat, affectless way that men use to report facts they are too exhausted to be properly angry about. His rations had been going short for 3 weeks, small amounts each time. A protein bar here, a pack of crackers there, enough to notice but small enough to question whether you were miscounting. Then Kowalski found a wrapper under Miller's bunk. Kowalski didn't report it officially. That's worth noting. In that environment, you handle things inside the unit when you can, because external reports create paperwork, and paperwork creates attention, and attention creates problems that take time away from staying alive. He handled it the way men handle things in that situation, directly, quietly, with the specific vocabulary that leaves no ambiguity about what happens next if it happens again. It happened again, just not with Kowalski. The cowardice was harder to document. Cowardice in combat is a complicated thing to name, because fear is universal, and the line between a man who flinches and a man who breaks is not always clean or obvious. I am not a man who condemns fear. I have been afraid every day I spent in that country, the kind of afraid that gets into the body and runs alongside everything else you're doing, permanently. Fear is not cowardice. What Miller did on the 14th was cowardice. I won't give you every detail because the men who were there still carry those details, and they're not mine to distribute. What I will tell you is that there was a moment, a specific, observable moment, when Miller had a clear choice between doing what the situation required and doing what his body was screaming at him to do. And he chose himself. He chose himself in a way and at a time that put the men around him at greater risk. Men who were already managing enough risk without having to manage for his absence too. Nobody was killed because of it, on that specific day. That's the grace that sometimes gets extended and doesn't mean it was earned. After that day, the calculation around Miller changed, not officially. Nothing changed officially, but unofficially, in the way that units make accommodations for the realities that paperwork doesn't capture. Miller started being positioned differently. Tasks assigned differently. Eyes kept on him with a specific, practical watchfulness that had nothing to do with pastoral care and everything to do with limiting the damage a man like that can do when the pressure peaks. That's the thing nobody tells you about combat medicine. The job description says you treat the wounded, and you do. But what the job actually is in practice is threat assessment. Constant 360-degree, never-sleeping threat assessment. And sometimes the threat is not the enemy. Sometimes the threat is the man sleeping in the bunk next to you. He died on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I noted the day in my log out of some procedural habit, the same way I noted everything. And the day I wrote down was a Tuesday in the kind of flat, gray November light that part of the world does very well, and that I have never been able to look at since without some part of my brain running the date arithmetic. We were withdrawing from a forward position. A managed withdrawal, not a rout, planned, sequenced, conducted the way a well-trained unit conducts these things, when the situation changes and staying put stops making tactical sense. It was not a moment of chaos. It was a moment of controlled, professional movement. Miller apparently had his own plan. What we reconstructed afterward from the physical evidence and from the two men who had the misfortune of being close enough to see it was that Miller had decided this was his exit. The withdrawal was cover. The movement of men and equipment in multiple directions was, in his assessment, the moment where one man moving in a slightly different direction wouldn't be noticed until it was too late to matter. He was partially right about that. What he was catastrophically wrong about was the hardware. He'd taken a weapon that wasn't his. That's the part that still not angers me. Anger is too simple a word for it. that still occupies a specific place in my chest when I think about it carefully. He took a weapon that belonged to a man who needed it, in a situation where that man's need was not abstract. And he took it because he'd calculated that a man attempting to desert through uncertain terrain needed to be better armed than his own rifle allowed. He wasn't wrong about the terrain. He was catastrophically wrong about the safety mechanism on the weapon he'd taken, which was different from his own, which he had apparently failed to properly familiarize himself with, which under the conditions of haste and fear and the particular motor skill degradation that comes from sustained adrenaline and insufficient sleep. The noise was significant, I'll say that much. Significant enough to create a problem for the men who were conducting a careful, quiet extraction, and who suddenly had a loud, directional event occurring at their 6 o'clock that required immediate reassessment of every assumption they'd been operating on. Nobody came back for him. That is the fact, and the fact is what it is. I went back after the unit was clear and secured and accounted for and the situation had stabilized into the particular post-event stillness that always follows these things. I went back because that's what the job is. The job is going back. What I found was not something I will describe in detail, and not something I described in the official incident report with any more specificity than the situation required. The report said what it needed to say and no more. Accidental discharge. Non-combat fatality. I signed it. I filed it. I moved on. Because moving on is also what the job is. His mother's name was Margaret. I found the address the way you find these things if you're determined enough and patient enough and have enough years between you and the events in question to approach them without the raw edges catching on everything. 8 years. It took me 8 years to decide to go, and another 6 months after that to actually drive the car. She lived in a small house in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of town that exists at a particular pace and temperature that is very specific to that part of the country. Quiet but not empty, modest but not poor, carrying its own dignity in the way it keeps its yards and its churches and its community boards outside the hardware store. Her house was white clapboard with a green door and a porch that had 2 rocking chairs on it that she clearly used regularly based on the wear patterns in the paint on the armrests. There was a flag in a triangle case in the front window. There was a photograph next to it, his official service portrait, the one they take early in the process, before the country has done what it does to a young man's face. He looked clean in it, earnest, like a person who might have been anything. I stood on her porch for 30 seconds before I knocked, looking at that portrait through the glass, and I was aware of a specific sensation in my chest that I do not have precise language for. She opened the door before I'd finished knocking. She'd been watching from somewhere inside. She was small, the way some women become small with age, not from any weakness, but from a process of concentration. Like the years had refined her down to the essential. White hair pulled back, a house dress and an apron she'd forgotten to remove or hadn't bothered to. She looked at me and she knew who I was before I said a word, because she'd been expecting someone like me, or hoping for someone like me, for 8 years, and the moment had arrived and she was ready for it. "You were with Dale," she said. It wasn't a question. She brought me inside and sat me at a kitchen table and put coffee in front of me without asking, and sat across from me with her hands folded in the way women of her generation fold their hands when they are bracing for something and want the world to know they are braced. The house was him. That's the only way I can describe it. Every flat surface had something on it. A wrestling trophy from what must have been middle school. A drawing he'd done at some age that got framed because she'd wanted it framed. Letters, photographs, the artifacts of a childhood, a life, a person, assembled with the specific, careful attention of someone who was preserving something against its own tendency to dissolve. In the living room, there was a corner that was different from the rest, more deliberate. A small table with a cloth on it, and on the cloth his Purple Heart and his other citations, and a photograph of him in uniform, and a candle that she clearly lit regularly based on the residue on the cloth. A shrine. She had built her son a shrine. She had built a shrine to a version of her son that had never quite existed. And she had been tending it for 8 years. And there was nothing in that room, and nothing in that woman's face that I was going to be the man who undid. We sat at the table for a while with the coffee, and she told me things about him when he was young that I received with the attention they deserved. The baseball. The way he'd wanted a dog for 3 years before she finally gave in. The time he drove her car into a ditch at 15 and came home and confessed immediately because, she said, he couldn't stand to lie to her. I noted that detail. Then she asked me with a directness that surprised me because I'd expected her to approach it more slowly. She put her cup down, and she looked at me with those steady, clear eyes, and she said, "Was he brave? At the end? Was my boy brave?" I have administered morphine to men who were going to die regardless of what I did next. I have made that call. I have looked at the math of a wound and understood what it said, and acted on that understanding in the only direction it allowed. Medicine calls this palliative care, the making comfortable of that which cannot be made whole. I looked at Margaret Miller across her kitchen table. I took a breath, and I began. I told her he was brave. I said it first, directly, without preamble, because she needed to hear the word before anything else. I said he was one of the bravest men in the unit. Not loudly, not with the performance of it, with the quiet, factual delivery of a man reporting something he observed professionally. Then I built the story. I used everything I actually knew about him. That's the trick of a good lie. It has to be mostly true. I used his height, the way he carried himself, the particular way he held his jaw when he was concentrating on something. I used the geography of where we actually were, the specific quality of the light on that particular day, the sounds that were actually present in that environment. I gave her real details, real sensory textures, real procedural specifics, and I arranged them around a different event than the one that happened. I told her there had been incoming. I told her the unit had been in a bad position, and that her son had made a decision that allowed 3 other men to reach cover. I told her he had moved toward the threat rather than away from it. She was leaning forward by then, both hands flat on the table. I told her what he looked like when I reached him. I borrowed the physical details of the worst wound I have ever worked on, which belonged to a different man in a different war, and I applied them to Miller's body and the geography of that gray November hillside. I made it a wound that would have been survivable with better resources. I made it a wound that bought him time. Time to talk. She needed last words. I knew she needed last words because every mother needs last words. So I gave him last words. I told her he said he was sorry he wasn't going to make it home. I told her he said she'd been a good mother. I told her he said he wasn't afraid. Each of these things cost me something. Not guilt, not shame. Something more like the specific effort of a muscle held under tension for a long time. I could feel the weight of the words as I said them, not because they were false, but because they mattered. Because they were landing somewhere that was desperate for them to land. Because this woman's remaining years, the quality of her sleep, the things she would say to herself in the dark when it came for her, all of it was being shaped by what I was saying to her at this kitchen table. She was crying by then, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't require any change in expression because it's been integrated into the face over years of practice. I didn't stop. I kept my voice level. I kept the pace of the story even. I watched her face the way I watch a patient's face for the specific information I needed. Is this landing? Is this working? Is she finding what she needs in what I'm giving her? I am a medic. I read bodies. I read faces. I read the signs of a person who is receiving something that is helping them, and I adjust accordingly. By the time I finished, her hands were around her coffee cup and her shoulders had dropped from where they'd been since I walked through the door. That's a clinical observation. Drop shoulders mean release tension. Release tension means the body has accepted something the mind was bracing against. The medicine had worked. I stood on that porch for a long time. I'm not a man who cries. I want to be clear about that, not as a point of pride, but as a relevant fact about the data available to me as I tried to understand what I was feeling on that porch. Whatever it wasn't guilt. It wasn't the specific weight of wrongdoing. It was something closer to the feeling I've had after very long surgeries when the patient is stable and the team is cleaning up, and the adrenaline is metabolizing and what's left is simply the exhaustion of sustained, precise effort. I had done something that required everything I had. I had done it correctly. I drove away from that town with a photograph on the passenger seat, and I didn't play the radio. And I thought about the things I think about on long drives, which mostly aren't things I can name. And I made a few decisions about Dale Miller that I have kept. I buried the truth. Not metaphorically. I made a decision, conscious and deliberate, that the actual events of that day would expire with me. I am the last custodian of that information, and when I'm done, it's done. Whatever record might exist in official documents uses language that can be read multiple ways by anyone who wants to read it a particular way. His mother has a hero. She has last words. She has a version of her son's final hour that will sustain her for whatever time she has left. And when she goes, she'll go with that story inside her, and it will have done its job. I did not help Dale Miller when he was alive. I couldn't. What he was, and there was no medicine for that. But I helped his mother. And I've thought, in the years since that kitchen table, about what medicine actually is. About what the job is at its foundation, underneath all the procedure and the protocol and the training. The job is the reduction of suffering. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else is in service of that single directive. I reduced her suffering. I used the only tool available to me in that room, which was language. And I used it with the same precision and the same intention I would have used a scalpel or a syringe. I gave her a dose of something that would make the remaining time bearable. I titrated it carefully. I watched her response and I adjusted. It was the most deliberate act of medicine I have performed in my life. I'm not interested in whether you think it was right. I've made my peace with it. I'll carry it the same way I carry everything else from those years, as mine, as evidence of a time and a place, and a set of impossible choices that nobody who wasn't there gets a vote on. What I will tell you is what I told nobody else for a very long time. Walking away from that house, photograph in my hand, the lie completed and delivered and received, I felt like a medic who had done his job. For the first time since the war,